Sears once controlled nearly 1% of the entire American economy. Not a company, an empire. But one decision, worth over $12 billion, quietly set off its collapse. And the strangest part? At the time, it looked like the smartest move they could make. And then it made a decision it would never recover from. This isn't just a story about a company that failed, it's about a decision. The kind that looks safe, logical, even necessary. Until years later, you realize it changed everything. Because what happened to Sears is still happening today. If you've ever worked in a company, watched one slowly fall apart, or even invested in one, you've seen this pattern. Success, then distraction, then decline that nobody notices until it's too late. But here's the part most people miss. It never feels like a mistake when it's happening. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where alarms go off. It's quieter than that. One decision, then another, then suddenly the foundation is gone. And for Sears, that process started at the exact moment it seemed most powerful. And that's what makes this story dangerous. To understand how Sears fell, you have to understand just how big it was. This wasn't just a retailer, it was the center of American life. Over 3,500 stores across the country, nearly $50 billion in annual revenue, and products in millions of homes. There was a time when, if something existed, Sears probably sold it. And if you couldn't get to a store, Sears would come to you. That kind of dominance doesn't just disappear. Something has to go wrong. Long before the internet, long before online shopping, Sears had already solved the problem. They printed it. The Sears catalog wasn't just a book. It was over 500 pages of possibility. Tools, clothes, appliances, even entire houses. You didn't need to live in a city. You didn't need access to stores. You just needed a mailbox. It was like having the internet, but instead of clicking, you flipped pages. And millions of Americans did exactly that. For families across rural America, this wasn't convenience. It was connection. The catalog brought the modern world to places where the nearest town could be miles away. For many, Sears wasn't just a company. It was a lifeline. And when something that essential starts to change, people don't notice right away, which makes what happened next even harder to understand. By the 1970s, Sears wasn't just dominant, it was untouchable. And they built the tallest building in the world, the Willis Tower, as a symbol of that dominance, 110 stories of steel and glass, a monument to a company that believed it would last forever. And for a while, it looked like it would. But this is usually the point where companies make their biggest mistakes. But inside that success, something was already changing. The system that made Sears powerful was starting to slow it down. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough that no one thought it was a problem. And then Sears made a decision that would turn that quiet weakness into something far worse. A decision that didn't look dangerous, until it was. In the early 1980s, instead of doubling down on the retail system that had made it dominant, Sears began shifting its focus towards something entirely different. In 1981, it acquired Dean Witter Reynolds, one of the largest brokerage firms in the United States, and just weeks later, it purchased Coldwell Banker, a major real estate company. Not long after, it expanded its ownership of Allstate Insurance, building what it believed would become a powerful financial services empire. The idea seemed logical. Retail was cyclical, unpredictable. Finance, on the other hand, offered stability, recurring revenue, and higher margins. If Sears could combine shopping, insurance, investing, and real estate under one umbrella, it wouldn't just be a retailer anymore. It would be a one-stop financial powerhouse embedded in everyday American life. On paper, it looked like the future. And that's exactly why it was so dangerous. In reality, it marked the beginning of a slow and costly shift away from everything that had made the company strong. Over the next decade, billions of dollars were poured into building and maintaining this financial division. By the mid-1990s, more than $12 billion in capital had been diverted into these ventures, money that no longer went into stores, logistics, pricing, or customer experience. And this is where everything starts to break. And the effects weren't immediate. That's what made it dangerous. Stores still opened. Sales still came in. The brand still carried weight. But underneath, the system was aging. Locations that once felt modern began to feel dated. Inventory systems fell behind. Competitors started experimenting with faster, more efficient supply chains. And while Sears remained anchored to infrastructure that had once been revolutionary but was now slowly becoming obsolete. Inside the company, the shift in priorities was clear. Resources, attention, and leadership focus were increasingly directed toward financial performance rather than retail execution. The core business wasn't being actively destroyed. It was simply no longer being improved. And in retail, that's the same thing. And in a competitive industry, standing still doesn't mean staying the same. It means falling behind. What Sears saw as diversification was, in reality, dilution. What looked like expansion was actually the beginning of its collapse. The company that had once been singularly focused on serving the American consumer was now split across multiple industries, each demanding attention, capital, and expertise. And while Sears was trying to become something new, other companies were becoming better at what Sears used to do best. And that gap was about to get much worse. At the same time, Sears was spreading its attention across finance and real estate. The ground beneath its core business was beginning to shift. Retail was changing, and it was changing fast. New competitors weren't trying to be everything to everyone. They were focused, disciplined, and built for a different kind of efficiency. Walmart expanded aggressively through rural America, the very region Sears had once dominated, using a relentless strategy built on low prices, tight cost control, and a supply chain designed for speed. Instead of relying on legacy systems, Walmart invested heavily in distribution centers, real-time inventory tracking, and cross-docking, allowing goods to move faster and cheaper than Sears could match. And this is where Sears starts losing ground. At the same time, a new class of retailers began attacking from every direction. Home Depot redefined hardware by offering massive selection and warehouse-scale pricing. Best Buy focused entirely on electronics, building expertise in varieties Sears couldn't compete with. Even apparel chains began pulling customers away with more specialized offerings. The one-stop shop model that had once made Sears unbeatable was starting to lose its advantage. Customers no longer wanted everything in one place. They wanted the best option in each category, and increasingly, Sears wasn't that option anymore. And once customers start leaving, they rarely come back. What made the shift dangerous was how gradual it felt. There was no single moment where Sears clearly lost. Market share slipped quietly. Foot traffic declined slowly. Customers didn't disappear all at once. They just stopped coming as often. Meanwhile, competitors were improving constantly, refining their systems, lowering their costs, and getting closer to the customer. Sears, by contrast, was operating with an older model in a rapidly changing environment, and the gap between them widened year by year. And then something even bigger changed. Then, as the retail landscape was already becoming more competitive, a new force began to emerge, one that would redefine shopping entirely, not through stores, but through a screen. Then, as the retail landscape was already becoming more competitive, a new force began to emerge, one that would redefine shopping entirely, not through stores, but through a screen. In the mid-1990s, as the internet began to move from curiosity to commercial reality, Sears had a rare advantage. It had already spent decades perfecting remote shopping. It understood catalogs, distribution, fulfillment, and nationwide delivery better than almost any company in the world. Translating that system online should have been a natural evolution. They should have dominated. But instead of leading the shift, Sears approached it cautiously, almost defensively. In 1995, it launched its online platform, investing over $150 million into what was supposed to be the digital extension of its catalog empire. The ambition was there, but the execution never matched it. The website relied on outdated back-end systems, with inventory data pulled from legacy catalog infrastructure that updated slowly and often inaccurately. Customers would place orders for items that appeared available only to find out days later they were out of stock. Pages loaded slowly. Navigation felt clunky. The experience was functional but not competitive. And in a market moving this fast, that was fatal. Inside the company, the digital initiative was never given the priority it required. Teams were small, budgets were inconsistent, and leadership remained focused on short-term financial performance rather than long-term transformation. E-commerce wasn't treated as the future of the business. It was treated as an experiment. Meanwhile, Amazon was building something entirely different. From the beginning, Amazon was designed around speed, accuracy, and customer experience. And its systems were built for real-time inventory, efficient fulfillment, and continuous improvement. While Sears was adapting an old model to a new medium, Amazon was creating a new model entirely. And that difference changed everything. By the early 2000s, the difference was becoming impossible to ignore. Online orders at Sears were expensive to fulfill, often costing significantly more per transaction than competitors. Delays and errors eroded customer trust. And while Sears struggled to make its digital platform work, Amazon expanded rapidly beyond books into electronics, appliances, and household goods, the very categories Sears had once dominated. The irony was complete. The company that had invented large-scale remote shopping was now unable to compete in the digital version of the same idea. What Sears had pioneered in paper, Amazon perfected in code, and by then, it was already too late. And by the time Sears began to recognize the scale of the shift, the advantage it once held had already slipped away. By the time Sears began to recognize the scale of the shift, the advantage it once held had already slipped away. What followed wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. With its retail performance weakening and its digital efforts falling behind, Sears turned to a different strategy. One focused less on rebuilding the business and more on extracting value from what remained. In 2005, Sears merged with Kmart to form Sears Holdings, a deal engineered by hedge fund manager Eddie Lampert, whose approach to the company was fundamentally different from traditional retail leadership. Instead of operating Sears as a unified business, it was broken into competing internal divisions, each measured by its individual financial performance. On paper, it created accountability. In practice, it fractured the company's ability to function as a cohesive system. Departments that once worked together began competing for resources. Investment decisions were driven by short-term returns rather than long-term growth. And this is where the decline becomes irreversible. At the same time, the company began selling off some of its most valuable assets to generate cash. Prime real estate, stores that had once anchored entire shopping centers, was spun off or sold and then leased back, turning owned assets into ongoing expenses. Iconic brands that had defined Sears for decades were also monetized. Craftsman, a name trusted by generations of American consumers, was sold, along with other key holdings, in an effort to manage rising debt and declining revenue. Each move provided temporary relief, but weakened the foundation of the business further. Stores deteriorated as maintenance budgets were cut. Inventory thinned. Customer experience declined. What had once been a destination began to feel outdated, then neglected, and eventually irrelevant. And once that perception sets in, it's almost impossible to reverse. And through it all, the underlying problem remained unchanged. The company wasn't investing in rebuilding its competitive edge. It was managing its decline. By the late 2000s, the numbers reflected what customers had already sensed. Sales had fallen sharply, debt had accumulated, and the gap between Sears and its competitors had become too wide to close. In October 2018, Sears Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, marking the end of a company that had once defined American retail. Tens of thousands of jobs were affected. Hundreds of stores were closed, and what remained of the business was reduced to fragments of its former self. The collapse was complete. What had started as a slow shift in priorities decades earlier had finally reached its conclusion. What had started as a slow shift in priorities decades earlier had finally reached its conclusion. But the real significance of Sears' collapse isn't just in what happened, it's in what it reveals. Because Sears didn't fail overnight, and it didn't fail because it lacked resources, brand recognition, or even opportunity. It failed because, at a critical moment, it shifted its focus away from the very thing that made it valuable. The $12 billion decision to prioritize financial services over retail didn't destroy Sears immediately. In fact, for a time, it made the company look more stable, more diversified, even more sophisticated. That's what made it so deceptive. But beneath that appearance, it created a gap between what the company was and what the market was becoming. And that gap, once it started widening, never closed. What makes this pattern dangerous is how easy it is to justify. Diversification sounds responsible. Cutting costs sounds efficient. Extracting value from assets sounds strategic. None of these decisions feel like mistakes in isolation, but together, over time, they shift a company away from innovation and toward preservation, from building the future to managing the present. And that shift is where companies begin to die. And in industries driven by competition and change, that shift is often irreversible. The same pattern has played out across multiple industries, in different forms at different times. Companies reach a position of strength, then begin optimizing for short-term performance instead of long-term relevance. They rely on systems that once worked, assuming they will continue to work. And by the time the environment changes enough to force a response, the cost of catching up is already too high. Sears is one of the clearest examples of this process, not because it lacked the ability to adapt, but because it stopped making adaptation its priority. The lesson isn't just about retail or even about one company. It's about how success, if not actively maintained, can quietly turn into vulnerability. And most of the time, no one sees it coming. And that's where the story becomes more than just history, because what happened to Sears isn't locked in the past. It's a pattern that continues to repeat itself. Today, there are companies that look just as dominant, just as untouchable as Sears once did. They have scale, brand recognition, loyal customers, and billions in revenue. On the surface, they appear secure. But beneath that surface, some are making the same kind of trade-offs, prioritizing short-term financial performance over long-term innovation, focusing on extracting value instead of creating it. In many cases, it doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like discipline. Costs are reduced, margins improve, shareholders are satisfied. But at the same time, investment in the core product slows, systems age, and the company's ability to adapt begins to weaken. And by the time it becomes obvious, it's already too late. The danger is that these shifts are rarely visible in the moment. They show up years later when competitors, often smaller, faster, and more focused, begin to take ground. And by then, the advantage that once seemed permanent is already gone. That's what makes the Sears story so relevant. It's not just about a company that failed. It's about how success can create blind spots, how confidence can delay necessary change, and how decisions that seem rational in isolation can collectively lead to decline. The next time you see a company dominating its industry, it's worth asking a simple question. Are they still building what made them successful, or have they started managing what they already have? Because that's the moment everything begins to change. Because in the end, the difference is what separates companies that last from those that fade. Sears didn't disappear because people stopped needing what it sold. It disappeared because it stopped being the best way to get it. The stores that once felt essential became optional, then outdated, and eventually unnecessary. The systems that once connected the country became slower than the alternatives, and the brand that once stood for reliability became a reminder of something that used to work. Today, across the United States, there are still hundreds of former Sears locations. Empty anchor stores sitting at the edges of malls, their signs removed, their entrances sealed, their parking lots overgrown. They're not just abandoned buildings. They're physical evidence of what happens when a company loses its direction while still believing it has time. They're reminders of a decision that didn't seem urgent until it was. For many people, those stores are tied to memories, buying tools with their parents, walking through aisles filled with appliances, flipping through catalogs at the kitchen table. And that's what makes the story linger. Sears wasn't just a business, it was part of everyday life. But nostalgia doesn't protect a company from change, and scale doesn't guarantee survival. What Sears built was extraordinary, but what it failed to do at the moment it mattered most was continue building. And in a world that keeps moving, that's a risk no company can afford. And maybe that's the most important part of this story, because it doesn't really end with Sears. The company is gone, but the conditions that led to its collapse are still very much alive. The same pressures are the same incentives, the same temptation to prioritize what looks safe today over what will matter tomorrow. Right now, there are companies operating at massive scale, generating billions in revenue, expanding into new areas, optimizing their balance sheets, and on the surface, it all looks like progress. But if you look closely, some of them are starting to drift away from the thing that made them valuable in the first place. Investment shifts. Focus spreads thin. Innovation slows. And none of it feels urgent because the numbers still look strong. That's exactly how it starts. Not with a crisis, but with a gradual shift in priorities that's easy to justify and hard to reverse. Sears didn't fail because it couldn't see the future. In many ways, it had already built it. What it failed to do was stay aligned with it. And that's the pattern that repeats, not just in retail, but in technology, finance, and every industry shaped by change. The companies that survive aren't always the biggest or the most established. They're the ones that keep investing in what made them relevant, even when it's easier not to. And the ones that don't, no matter how dominant they once were, eventually find themselves looking back at a position they can't recover. The only difference is that we haven't seen the ending yet.